There are moments that remind you exactly what kind of world you want to live in. And sometimes those moments come from the most unexpected places. Not from a formal speech, not from a march, not from a headline carried across the front page of a newspaper, but from a game show stage in the middle of an afternoon taping when one man says something ugly and another man decides, in real time and in front of everyone watching, that he is not going to let it slide, that he is going to stop. That some things matter more than the schedule, more than the segment, more than keeping the peace and getting back to the game. If you have ever wanted to see what it looks like when someone with a real platform actually uses it the right way, stay right here, because this story is exactly that. And if you are new to this channel, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because every week we bring you the moments that television captures but the world sometimes forgets to sit with long enough. Now let us get into what happened on that stage, who was there, what was said, how every person in that room responded, and why the 5 words that came out of it became something people are still quoting today. The Johnson family from Birmingham, Alabama, had been planning their Family Feud appearance for almost a year. They were a 4-generation family rooted deep in the South, with the kind of history that does not fit neatly on a television application form, but colors everything about who you are, how you walk into a room, and what you do when that room tries to test you. The family patriarch, 71-year-old Reverend Earl Johnson, had been a pastor for over 4 decades in the same church his father had helped build in the 1950s. That church had survived bombings during the civil rights movement. It had survived organized attempts to push its congregation out of the neighborhood. It had survived the slow, grinding erosion that takes down so many community institutions over the years. The loss of funding, the loss of young people, the loss of momentum that comes when a neighborhood changes faster than a community can keep up. It was still standing because the people inside it had decided, generation after generation, that standing was simply what they did. Reverend Earl had spent 40 years at that pulpit telling his congregation the same truth in different words every Sunday. Your dignity is not something the world gave you, and therefore it is not something the world can take. That message had traveled from the pulpit into the Johnson household and into the choices every member of his family made from that point forward. His daughter, 46-year-old Renee, was a high school principal who had spent the last 8 years running one of the highest-performing schools in her district. A school where 62% of students came from low-income households, and where the graduation rate had climbed from 71 to 94% under her leadership. She had achieved that not by lowering expectations, but by raising investment, spending more time, more energy, more of herself in that building than anyone had a right to ask. Renee did not accept excuses from herself or from anyone else. She had learned that directly from her father, and she had spent her career passing it forward to the next generation of young people who sat in her hallways. Her husband, Damon, was a firefighter with 18 years of service, a man of very few words and very consistent action, the kind of person whose colleagues describe as the one they want beside them when everything is going wrong and there is no clean solution. Their 2 adult children rounded out the 5-person team. Marcus, 24, was a second-year law student with a sharp mind and a quiet intensity that made people underestimate him right up until the moment they stopped. Keisha, 22, was a nursing student with 2 semesters left before graduation, and she was the reason this Family Feud adventure existed at all. She had been sending her family draft applications for 3 years before they finally agreed. She had argued, negotiated, demonstrated, and charmed every single member of that family into saying yes, including the one who required the most convincing. Reverend Earl had taken the most work. He was not a television man by nature. He was a pulpit man, a community man, someone who measured the value of things by whether they built something lasting. But Keisha had worn him down with the specific persistence that only grandchildren can deploy, the combination of genuine love and absolute stubbornness that makes resistance eventually feel both pointless and unkind. He agreed on one condition: the family would pray together before every practice session. They did, every single time. Sitting around Renee's kitchen table with flashcards spread across the middle and their hands joined at the edges, saying something true before they did something fun. Before we talk about what happened in that studio, it is worth spending a moment on what Birmingham meant to this family, because it was not just a hometown. It was a context. It was a living reminder, passed down through dinner table conversations and church sermons, and the occasional drive past buildings that still carried the weight of what had happened inside them, of the specific kind of resilience that gets built when your community has survived things that should have been unsurvivable. Reverend Earl had been 7 years old during the church bombings of the early 1960s. He had grown up understanding, in the way that children understand things that adults try to shield them from, that the world contained people who did not believe his life was worth protecting. That knowledge had not made him bitter. It had made him deliberate. It had made him a man who chose every word carefully, who treated every person who walked into his church as someone deserving of full human dignity regardless of anything else about them, and who had raised his daughter to do the same. Renee had grown up watching her father extend that grace even to people who did not extend it back, and she had carried that model into her school, a place where she told her students, constantly and in different ways, that the way other people treat you tells you everything about them and nothing about your worth. That was the household Marcus and Keisha had grown up in. That was the air they had breathed. And that was the invisible foundation underneath everything the Johnson family brought onto that game show stage. The competing family that day was the Calloway family from a suburb outside Nashville, Tennessee. 5 of them, 2 brothers in their 30s, their father, and 2 cousins. They were loud and confident, clearly comfortable in front of cameras in the way that people are when they have spent years imagining themselves in exactly this situation. They were fast in the pre-game banter with Steve Harvey, quick with jokes, easy with each other. There was nothing obviously alarming about them in the first few minutes. They were just another Family Feud family doing what Family Feud families do. The tension started quietly. During the opening introductions, as Steve moved between the families doing his warm-up, one of the Calloway brothers, a 34-year-old named Todd, made a comment under his breath to his brother while Reverend Earl was speaking. It was quiet enough that the studio audience did not catch it, but Renee did, and Marcus, standing close enough, heard it clearly too. They exchanged one look. Neither said a word. Both of them made the silent calculation that black families in America make constantly in spaces where they are the only black family in the room. Is this the moment, or do we keep going? They let it go. The game started. For the first 2 rounds, both families played well. The Callaways were aggressive and fast, the way teams play when their approach is to overwhelm from the front. The Johnsons were steady and precise, the way a family plays when its members have been genuinely practicing together at a kitchen table for months, when their strategy is built not on speed but on trust and accuracy and the deep comfort of people who have been making decisions together for decades. The score stayed close, which raised the energy in the studio. The audience was genuinely invested. Steve Harvey was in full form. From every angle, it looked like a great episode. And then, during a brief pause between rounds while the production team fixed a technical problem with one of the scoreboards, Todd Calloway said it. Clearly this time. Not whispered to his brother, not under his breath. Loud enough for audience members in the front rows to catch it. Loud enough for Steve Harvey's production crew near the stage to hear it. Loud enough for Reverend Earl Johnson, 71 years old, 4 decades of pastoral service, a lifetime of building something in a city that had tried to burn things like it down, to hear every single word with no possibility of misunderstanding. The comment was framed as being about how the Johnsons were playing the game, but it did not stay about the game. In the space of 1 sentence, Todd reduced this family, their months of preparation, their composure, their unity, their competence, to a racial stereotype delivered as a punchline. He used specific language. He did not hedge or soften it. He said it the way people say things when they believe in that moment that the people around them will think it is funny and that there will be no real consequence. Nobody thought it was funny. The front rows of the studio audience went completely still. People in the middle rows shifted in their seats. The involuntary physical response of human beings who have just heard something that should not have been said and are processing in real time what they are supposed to do with it. Keisha, who had spent 3 years building this day into existence, who had dreamed about this exact moment, who had practiced for it every evening at her grandmother's kitchen table, Keisha looked straight ahead at nothing. The way you do when you are in public, and you will absolutely not give someone the satisfaction of seeing that they reached you. Damon placed his hand on her shoulder without looking at her, and without saying a word. The quiet, automatic protection of a father who has been shielding his kids from different versions of the same thing for their entire lives. Marcus turned his head and looked directly at Todd with the precise, controlled calm of someone who has trained himself not to react physically, because he understands from the law he is studying, and from the skin he lives in exactly what happens when young black men in America react physically. And Reverend Earl Johnson closed his eyes for 3 full seconds, just 3. Then he opened them, and he stood up a little straighter than he had been standing before. Steve Harvey had heard every word. He had been standing close enough that there was no possible ambiguity about what had been said or who had said it. And the people watching his face said that something moved across it, not dramatically, not in the explosive way that makes for easily shareable television, but in the slow, deliberate way of a person who has made a decision, who knows what they are about to do, who is fully committed. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform outrage for the cameras. He stopped moving, turned completely to face Todd Calloway, and let the silence sit for long enough that every person in that studio became aware of what was coming. Then he spoke. "I need you to understand something," Steve said. His voice was level, the kind of careful that is more powerful than any amount of volume. "What you just said, I heard it, my crew heard it, this family heard it, and I am not going to stand on this stage and pretend that I didn't." Todd's expression shifted. He started to smile in the way people smile when they are hoping something will be laughed off and forgotten. Steve Harvey did not smile back. "I want to ask you something," Steve continued, his voice still perfectly even. "Do you know what this family has built? Do you know what that man," he gestured toward Reverend Earl, who stood with his hands clasped, his posture completely straight, "has given his entire life to? Do you know what it took for this family to be standing on this stage today, carrying themselves the way they are carrying themselves?" He paused for a long beat. "Because I know, and it is a whole lot more than whatever you thought you were being clever about." The studio was completely silent, not the manufactured quiet of reality television, the real kind. The kind that happens when something genuinely true is being said in a room and everyone present understands this is not a moment for any noise at all. Steve turned to the production team. "I need to stop the game." Then back to Todd, his voice still completely steady. "I'm going to ask you to leave the stage." There was an audible exhale from the audience, not quite a gasp, something more helpless than that. Todd started to object. He said it was just a joke. He said people were too sensitive. He said it was not meant the way it sounded. And Steve Harvey, the man who built his entire career on warmth, on relatability, on making everyone in any room feel welcome and seen, looked at him and said something that became one of the most replayed moments in that stage's history. "Nah," Steve said. "We're not doing the 'it was just a joke' part. I've been black my whole life and I know exactly what that was. And this family has been too gracious to say what I'm about to say for them. That was not a joke. That was something ugly wearing the costume of a joke. And there is no place for it. Not here, not anywhere." Todd Calloway left the stage, his family visibly shaken, several of them looking at the floor in the specific way of people who are embarrassed and possibly, on some level, not entirely surprised, reorganized. The production team worked through the logistics of a situation Family Feud had no clean protocol for. Steve Harvey was not thinking about protocol. He walked across the stage to where the Johnsons stood. He positioned himself directly in front of Reverend Earl. He did not make a speech. He did not perform compassion for the cameras. He looked at the man and said simply, "I'm sorry that happened in a place you came to have a good time." And Reverend Earl Johnson, 71 years old, 4 decades of pastoral wisdom, a lifetime spent choosing grace without ever confusing grace for weakness, looked at Steve Harvey and said 5 words that became the most replayed, most quoted, most widely shared moment the show had produced in years. "Let's play the game." The studio erupted. Not with the practiced applause of an audience responding to a cue, with the involuntary, full-body response of people who have just heard exactly the right thing said with exactly the right weight at exactly the right moment. Several audience members were on their feet before they realized they had stood. Some were crying. The sound in that room was not enthusiasm. It was recognition. The recognition of something true. Steve Harvey turned away for one moment. He pressed his lips together, breathed, and composed himself in the way of someone who has spent decades learning to manage his emotions in public, not suppress them, but channel them so they work for the moment rather than against it. Then he turned back, straightened his jacket, and said to the audience and the cameras and to anyone watching at home, "Let's play this game the right way, the way this family has been playing it since they walked in here." The Johnsons played the rest of that game with a focus that was remarkable given everything that had just happened. There is something worth saying about what it actually takes to do that, to step back from a moment that would justify falling apart and choose instead to be fully present in what you came to do. Most people, when something like that happens in a public space, spend the rest of the day trapped inside it. They replay the words. They rehearse responses they did not give. Their body is in the room, but they are not. The Johnson family was where their body was, every single one of them. Keisha was sharp and bright and fully herself on every answer, the joy of someone doing the thing they prepared for not diminished by what had come before it. Damon was exactly who he always is, the reliable one, the steady presence, the man whose consistency is his contribution, and who gives it without waiting to be asked. Marcus handled the fast-thinking rounds with a composure that came from 2 years of law school training and a lifetime of knowing that the clear head is always the most powerful one in any room. And Reverend Earl, when asked to name something people do when they want to feel better, gave one word without a single moment of hesitation. Pray. Number one answer. 43 points. The studio response was exactly what you would expect from a room full of people who had just watched a family refuse to be broken. The Johnsons won their main game and had a strong, fast money round. No records, no perfect score. A real, earned, well-played victory by a family that had already demonstrated something far more important than any game show score before the final round even began. When the episode aired, the response was enormous and immediate. The clip of Steve stopping the game spread to every corner of the internet within hours. News programs aired it. Radio hosts played the audio and talked about it. But the clip that traveled furthest and stayed longest was not the confrontation with Todd. It was the 5 seconds of Reverend Earl saying 5 words. That clip ended up in classrooms across the country. Teachers showed it as part of lessons about civic courage, about dignity, about the specific kind of strength that is built over decades and not performed, but simply revealed when the moment requires it. A high school educator in Georgia wrote publicly that the discussion her class had about those 5 words was the most substantive conversation she had facilitated in 15 years of teaching. Not just about the racism of the original comment, but about every choice that followed it. What Steve chose to do with the authority he had. What Reverend Earl chose to say when he had every right to say something angrier. What it means to respond with intention rather than react with emotion. What a family looks like when it has practiced, quietly and consistently, being exactly who it is. Thousands of people who had never watched a single episode of Family Feud in their lives left comments on that clip, describing their own experiences in rooms where something had been said, and they had not known what to do. Describing the private weight of those moments that get carried home and never talked about. Describing the relief of seeing it handled, openly, cleanly, without anyone losing themselves in the process. One comment, shared more than 60,000 times, said, "I have sat in meetings my entire career where something like this happened and nobody said a word. Not one word. And then I watched a 71-year-old pastor on a game show say 5 words that made me feel like the thing I have needed to say for 20 years finally got said. I'm going to think about that man for a long time." The impact did not stop at the level of social media statistics. In the weeks that followed the episode's airing, something quieter and more meaningful began to happen in the spaces where real conversation lives. Adoption advocacy organizations reached out to Steve Harvey's production team to talk about how the show had created an unplanned but important national moment. Civil rights educators began incorporating the clip into curriculum materials about how dignity functions as resistance, about the specific history of Black Americans choosing grace as a form of power rather than weakness, tracing a line from the nonviolent sit-ins of the civil rights movement to a 71-year-old man on a game show stage saying 5 words that carried 4 centuries of practiced endurance behind them. Several corporations quietly reached out to Renee, the principal, asking her to speak to their employees about workplace dignity and what it looks like in practice, about how a culture of respect does not just happen but is built, day after day, through choices that cost something. She accepted a handful of those invitations, always emphasizing the same thing her father had always emphasized. That dignity is not a response to how the world treats you. It is something you decide on before you walk into the room, so the room cannot take it. Reverend Earl preached about dignity the Sunday after the episode aired, to the congregation that had known him for 4 decades, in the church that his father helped build, and that had survived every attempt to diminish or destroy it. He said that dignity is not what you display when things are going well. It is what you have built in private, through thousands of small choices made when nobody is watching, so that when the public moment arrives, you already know who you are and there is nothing to decide. He said the ugliness of other people is never your emergency. He said your response always is. And he said that the best way to defeat anything that tries to make you smaller is to be so completely, consistently yourself that the attempt becomes irrelevant. Keisha graduated from nursing school the following spring. Marcus continued law. Damon continued going to work. Renee continued running one of the best schools in her district. And Reverend Earl continued preaching in the same church. The one his father helped build, the one that survived everything thrown at it, the one that keeps going because the people inside it made a choice, a long time ago, about what kind of people they were going to be. The ugliness that shows up in rooms, in offices, in schools, in studios, in the silences between sentences that were supposed to be harmless. That ugliness is not new. The Johnson family knew that before they ever walked into that building. They had known it their whole lives. What Reverend Earl's church had taught, what Renee's school practiced every day, what Damon and Marcus and Keisha had grown up understanding, was not how to avoid those moments, because you cannot always avoid them, but how to move through them without surrendering the most important thing you carry. Your sense of who you are. Your commitment to the reason you came. Your refusal to let someone else's floor become your ceiling. What is worth carrying from this story is not that a bad moment happened. Bad moments happen every single day to people who do not get cameras or viral clips or comment sections full of support. What is worth carrying is what the Johnson family demonstrated about how a human being can move through something like that without becoming defined by it, without giving the moment more power than it deserves, without letting someone else's ugliness determine who you are or what your day becomes. You do not have to perform strength. You do not have to make a speech. You do not have to have the perfect response ready. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, the thing that requires the deepest roots, the most years of practice, and the clearest sense of who you are, is simply to look forward, stand straight, and say 5 words that carry 40 years of work behind them. Let's play the game. If this story stayed with you, if something in it connected to something you have felt or witnessed or carried quietly, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below and tell us which part of this story hit you hardest, because this community shows up in the comments in a way that matters, and your voice is part of what makes this space worth coming back to. And if you are not already here with us, hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about real dignity, real courage, and the moments that remind every one of us what we are capable of when we decide to meet the world at our full height. We will see you in the next one.